Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're going to be looking at the 2009 film Solomon Kane. And this one came from one of you guys.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so thanks for the suggestion. This one, it wasn't really on my radar, to be honest.
Yeah.
And the review we got called it an underrated dark fantasy adventure. So,
Okay.
yeah. So, I was really interested to kind of dig into this one and see if it lived up to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a film you hear a lot about. It's based on a character created by Robert E. Howard, who also, as you know, created Conan the Barbarian.
Oh, wow.
So it's interesting that it hasn't had the same kind of staying power, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. And I was thinking that maybe that's because, like, looking at the synopsis, it follows that classic hero's journey, right?
Yep. Right.
Where, like, we meet the hero at a low point.
Yeah.
And they face challenges and temptations and all that, like the classic hero's journey.
Yeah. And the reviewer did mention that it falls into some predictable fantasy tropes from time to time. But, I think where Solomon Kane does succeed is in its execution.
Okay.
So, James Purefoy, who plays Solomon Kane,
yeah,
he really gives a great performance as Solomon Kane.
Right.
You mentioned that in your review, and it's a great point, He really convincingly portrays both the internal struggle of the character, but also just like the intensity of the action and the fighting.
Yeah, I can see how that role, just from looking at like screenshots and stuff, it seems like it would demand a certain kind of presence to be believable. Though.
Definitely. You have to have a certain gravitas, I guess.
Yeah.
To pull off a brooding 16th century mercenary seeking redemption.
Yeah, I can see that.
But yeah, he brings a real depth to the role that kind of elevates it beyond just your typical action hero.
Okay.
You really see him grappling with his past, his violent past.
Right.
And he's taken a vow of nonviolence, which just is constantly butting up against, like, the nature of who he is.
That's fascinating. So, like, the movie's setting him up with this internal conflict right from the beginning.
Exactly.
Yeah. I'm curious about that vow of nonviolence because you also mentioned that one of the criticisms you had was that his return to violence felt a little bit rushed.
Yeah.
Do you think that undermines that kind of internal struggle at all?
That's a good question. I think, overall, the film does a decent job of balancing its quieter moments with the action sequences.
Right.
But that particular transition, I do think could have benefited from maybe a more nuanced approach.
Okay.
Like a slower burn, to really kind of draw out the process of him coming to terms with, breaking that vow.
Okay, so like his decision to return to violence wasn't as impactful as it could have been.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Yeah. You also mentioned that like the supporting cast was really great.
Yeah.
And that even though the villain Malachi wasn't as well developed as you'd hoped, the supporting cast really stood out.
Yes, and I think they did a great job with the casting.
Yeah.
For example, Max von Sydow, who plays Solomon Kane's father.
Wow.
He brings such a weightiness to that role that speaks volumes about, their relationship, the family dynamics at play there. And then even Rachel Hurdwood and Pete Postlethwaite, they're in smaller roles.
Yeah.
But they bring this kind of emotional depth to the family that Kane is trying to protect.
I see. Okay. So even though it's an action movie, it's got like a real strong emotional core to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And visually, it's a really rich and believable world.
Okay.
And I think, the director, Michael J. Bassett, and the cinematographer, Dan Lawson, had worked together previously on a World War I horror film called Death Watch.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
And I feel like that experience really kind of informed their approach to Solomon Kane.
Oh, that's a cool connection. I'm always fascinated by how directors like their past work can inform their current projects.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, you can see echoes of their previous films in their current work sometimes.
Right.
But yeah, in Solomon Kane, they create this very specific aesthetic.
Okay.
It's bleak, gritty.
Yeah.
But there's also this kind of stark beauty to the 17th century English landscapes.
Oh, okay. So like historically accurate, but also like timeless.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned in your review that the film is visually stunning, but that some of the CGI elements haven't aged well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a challenge that a lot of filmmakers face, right?
Right.
Especially when you're dealing with magic and monsters in a historical setting.
Yeah.
The practical effects and the set design in Solomon Kane are superb.
Okay.
Like the medieval towns, the costumes, it all feels very authentic. However, some of the CGI, especially when it comes to the creatures and the sorcery, it's where the film kind of shows its age.
Right.
CGI has come a long way.
Oh, yeah. for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially like from 2009 to now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But even with those kind of dated effects, I still think the overall visual experience is very immersive.
Okay, cool.
And the dark, moody atmosphere combined with the film's sound design and score, it all comes together to create this really captivating world.
Yeah. Speaking of sound, you did mention in your review that both the sound design and music enhance the overall experience.
Yeah, I think Klaus Badelt, who did the score, he
Yeah.
did a fantastic job.
Yeah.
Really created this blend of like orchestral grandeur, but then these like darker, more melancholic themes as well that perfectly underscore Kane's internal struggle. And then the sound design during the fight sequences is just visceral.
Oh, wow.
You can hear every clang of the metal, every roar of the creatures he's facing.
Okay, cool. So we've got this rich world. We've got this hero struggling with his past. We've got a supporting cast that pushes him to grow. But you did mention that the villain felt underdeveloped.
That's right. Malachi, while menacing in appearance, he just lacks depth.
Okay.
The film doesn't really delve into his motivations or his backstory, which I think would have made him a more compelling antagonist.
Right, right. Because if you don't understand the villain, then the stakes don't feel as high.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It would have been fascinating to understand what drove him to embrace darkness, so completely.
So it's like a missed opportunity to really make him a three-dimensional character.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So we've talked about the hero, the visuals, the sound, the villain.
Yeah.
What about the story itself? You mentioned it follows a classic hero's journey. But is there anything about Solomon Kane's journey that stands out?
Well, I was thinking about your comparison to films like Van Helsing and The Witcher.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how they all have that blend of historical elements
Right.
with fantasy, but they each handle it in their own way.
Yeah, for sure.
Van Helsing really leans into that gothic horror aesthetic. Yeah. And then The Witcher, of course, is drawing on this rich literary world that's already established.
Right, yes, right.
But Solomon Kane just feels so grounded in its historical setting.
Yeah. You mentioned in your review that even though it's historically accurate, it still feels timeless.
Yes, exactly. It really captures that brutality and darkness of the 17th century,
Yeah.
The poverty, the religious persecution, the threat of violence, it's all there.
Yeah.
But amidst that, you have Solomon Kane's struggle for redemption.
Right.
And his battle against evil, and those themes resonate across time periods.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost like those themes of darkness and light are amplified.
Right.
By being set against such a stark historical backdrop.
Yeah, I think it's more than just a fantastical adventure. It's really a reflection of the human condition.
Right.
This timeless struggle to find meaning and purpose in a world that can feel very chaotic and unjust.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to Solomon Kane himself. You mentioned that he's more of an anti-hero than a traditional hero.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
He very much embodies that classic Byronic hero archetype.
Oh, okay.
Brooding, tormented, haunted by his past.
Right.
He's capable of great violence.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you see him wrestling with the consequences of his actions.
No.
He's trying to find a path to atonement.
It's that inner conflict that makes him so interesting to watch.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we as humans are drawn to characters who are flawed.
Yeah.
Who make mistakes.
Yeah.
Because it reminds us of our own humanity.
Exactly. And I think James Purefoy really captures that.
Yeah.
In his performance, he brings a vulnerability
Okay.
to the role that just makes you root for him.
Yeah.
Even when he's not making the best choices.
Right. And it's a shame it seems like that this film didn't get more recognition at the time.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like it had all the makings of a really great franchise.
It really did.
Especially with all this rich source material from Robert E. Howard to draw from.
Yeah.
It's a shame.
And Purefoy was so committed to the role.
Yeah.
I mean, I would love to have seen these stories continue.
Right.
Maybe exploring, different time periods, different cultures.
Oh, yeah. Like I can imagine Solomon Kane traveling to the New World.
Yes.
And like battling Native American spirits or something like that.
Exactly. Or, ancient Egypt.
Oh, yeah.
Facing off against, forgotten deities.
That'd be cool.
Navigating, the political intrigue of the pharaohs.
Yeah, those are really cool ideas.
Yeah.
I hope someone picks this up.
Yeah.
With all the fantasy shows that are popular now.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll revisit this. Give it the attention it deserves.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely an audience for it.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the success of, The Witcher. Shadow and Bone. People love these kind of gritty, character-driven fantasy stories.
Yeah.
And I think Solomon Kane, with its blend of history
Right.
and supernatural thrills, it would really resonate with modern viewers.
Yeah, for sure. Now, we talked earlier about the villain Malachi
Yeah.
being underdeveloped. Do you think that was like a major flaw in the film, or could it be seen as like an opportunity?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's a bit of both.
Okay.
Because his lack of depth
Yeah.
does kind of detract from the overall narrative tension.
Right.
If we had a more nuanced villain,
Right.
someone with a more compelling backstory,
Yeah.
understandable motivations, it would have just made that conflict more engaging.
And it's always more interesting when the villain isn't just purely evil.
Right.
Right. When you can see like glimmers of humanity in their darkness.
Exactly.
That makes them but scarier.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it does leave room for future stories.
Right.
Right. Like, what if they did revisit this?
Exactly.
What were the origins of evil in this world?
Yeah. Who was Malachi before he embraced the darkness?
Yeah.
What events shaped him?
Right. Like, what if he was a good guy once?
Exactly.
A warrior like Solomon Kane.
Yeah.
But something happened.
Right.
Maybe he was betrayed.
Yeah.
Or corrupted by some kind of ancient power.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
Yeah. And exploring those complexities would add depth not only to the villain,
Right.
but to the world itself.
Yeah, for sure.
It raises these questions about the nature of good and evil,
Right.
the choices that we make,
Right.
and the consequences that ripple through time.
And you could even tie that back into Solomon Kane's own struggle for redemption.
Absolutely.
Right. It's like he's fighting against that same darkness that consumed Malachi.
Yeah.
And he's trying to make sure he doesn't succumb to that same fate.
You get this kind of thematic link between the hero and the villain.
Right.
And it suggests that the line between good and evil isn't always so clear-cut.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about the potential for future stories.
Yeah.
But let's focus back on the film itself.
Right.
You gave it a 7.5 out of 10
Yeah.
in your review.
Yeah.
What contributed to that score?
I mean, for me, the film's strengths really lie in its visual storytelling, that immersive world building that we talked about, and James Purefoy's performance.
Right.
I mean, those elements just create such an engaging experience.
Yeah.
You're really drawn into that world and invested in his journey.
But it sounds like the underdeveloped villain and the occasional predictable plot points held it back from being like a truly great film.
Yeah, I think those aspects did detract
Yeah.
from the overall narrative.
Right.
But at the same time, I don't think the film's flaws completely overshadow its strengths.
Right.
It's still a solid entry in the dark fantasy genre.
Right.
And I think it deserves more attention than it's gotten.
It sounds like it's one of those films that, while not perfect,
Right.
still offers a lot to appreciate.
Yeah.
Especially for fans of the genre.
Yeah, for fans of historical fantasy.
Right.
Gritty action, definitely.
And I think it's important to remember that not every film needs to be like a masterpiece to be enjoyable.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes it's those imperfections that make it memorable, that spark discussion and debate.
Yeah.
Solomon Kane is a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
It's flawed,
Yeah.
but it's fascinating.
Right.
It's entertaining,
Yeah.
but it's also thought-provoking. It's not afraid to explore these complex themes.
Yeah.
And to challenge our expectations
Right.
of what a fantasy film can be.
And that's what makes it so fun to break down.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. It's like it leaves you with more questions
Right.
than answers,
Yeah.
which is always a good thing.
Definitely.
It makes you think.
And that's what we've tried to do here today.
Yeah.
To encourage you to think critically about the film, to appreciate its strengths, acknowledge its weaknesses, and ultimately form your own conclusions about its place in the world of dark fantasy.
So as we wrap up part 2 of this deep dive into Solomon Kane, what are some of the key takeaways that you hope our listeners are left with?
Well, I think for me, it's that idea of redemption. Solomon Kane's a character who's made some terrible mistakes, but he's actively trying to make amends for his past,
Right.
It really makes you wonder, if true redemption is ever possible.
Yeah.
Especially when you've done things you can't undo.
Right. And you mentioned earlier that Solomon Kane, even though it wasn't a huge hit, might had some influence on the current, wave of dark fantasy films and TV shows? I think so.
Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I mean, Solomon Kane didn't achieve the same kind of widespread popularity as, say, Game of Thrones or The Witcher.
Right.
But it was part of the shift
okay.
in how fantasy was portrayed on screen.
Right.
It embraced a more grounded and realistic aesthetic,
Yeah.
moving away from those high fantasy tropes like elves and dragons and towards a darker, more morally ambiguous world.
Right, and you can kind of see that in shows like The Witcher, where the characters are really complex and flawed. The violence is much more visceral, and the line between good and evil is definitely blurred.
Yeah, and I think Solomon Kane helped pave the way for that kind of storytelling.
Okay.
It showed that audiences were ready
right.
for a more nuanced, gritty approach to fantasy.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about how a film that wasn't a huge commercial success can still have like a lasting impact on the genre.
Yeah, influence isn't always about box office numbers, know? Sometimes it's about planting a seed.
Okay.
Introducing an idea or a style that other filmmakers pick up and build upon.
And it sounds like Solomon Kane did that.
I think so.
Even if it was in a subtle way.
Yeah, yeah.
So we talked a lot about the film's strengths.
Yeah.
And its potential for influencing the genre.
Right.
But, there were some aspects that didn't quite work as well. Like you mentioned, the villain Malachi was underdeveloped.
Right.
And the film occasionally relied on some predictable plot points.
Yeah.
Do you think those flaws prevent it from being a truly great film?
Well, I mean, it's true that those flaws hold the film back from reaching its full potential.
Oh.
I think a more complex villain and some more innovative plot twists would have definitely elevated the narrative.
Yeah, those are valid criticisms.
Yeah.
But I also think it's important to remember that not every film needs to be a masterpiece.
Right.
To be enjoyable.
Exactly. Sometimes it's those imperfections that make a film memorable.
Right.
That spark discussion and debate.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think Solomon Kane is a perfect example of that.
Right.
It's flawed.
Yeah.
But fascinating. Entertaining, but thought-provoking.
Right.
It's not afraid to explore those complex themes and challenge our expectations of what a fantasy film can be.
And that's what makes it so interesting to dig into.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
I like those films that leave you with more questions than answers.
Definitely.
It makes you think.
It sparks the imagination.
Yeah.
Makes you want to dig deeper.
Absolutely.
And that's what we've tried to do in this deep dive, to encourage you to think critically about the film.
Yeah.
To appreciate its strengths, acknowledge its weaknesses, and ultimately come to your own conclusions about its place in the world of dark fantasy.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on Solomon Kane,
what
would you say to someone who's on the fence about watching it?
I'd say if you're a fan of dark fantasy, if you enjoy films that blend history and the supernatural, and if you're intrigued by flawed heroes battling their inner demons, then Solomon Kane is definitely worth checking out.
Okay. Not perfect.
Right.
But it sounds like it's a very unique and compelling journey.
Absolutely.
Full of stunning visuals and intense action.
Yes.
And a thought-provoking exploration of redemption.
Definitely.
And destiny.
And who knows, you might just discover your next favorite cult classic.
That's a great way to put it. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic, ready to explore new worlds and spark new conversations.
Sounds good.
Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and as always, keep diving deep.